What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this one, I'm going to be showing you how to build this, an awesome $1,500 gaming PC build for 2024 and beyond. I'm going to cover off all the parts that make this build possible, how to put the system together step by step, and even check out AMD's answer to frame generation, fluid motion frames, in the benchmark section later on. Let's do this. The ASUS ROG Swift PG49 WCD is an insane 49-inch super ultra-wide panel that packs a punch. With a vibrant QD OLED display, 0.03 millisecond response time and 144 Hz refresh rate, this thing is crazy. The 1000 nits peak brightness, backed up with a custom heatsink design and improved airflow, keeps the panel bright and prevents burn-in, while a built-in KVM and 90 watts of USB-C power delivery makes this a great monitor for a multitude of applications. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Let's rewind it back to before this system was built, and actually the point in which I was picking the parts to make this build possible. The first thing I always do is head over to a site like PC Part Picker or Newegg and actually start to spec up the parts that I think make sense for this build. Now, looking at PC Part Picker, I think I've made some pretty good progress so far. For the CPU, I've got AMD's Ryzen 5 7600X. 6 cores, 12 threads, and really good boost clock speeds make it great for single and multi-threaded performance. It's cheaper than the competition, can be overclocked on more affordable motherboards, and of course is going to give us smart access memory support if we go for an AMD GPU too, but more on that later. As far as cooling goes, we are going to be able to overclock the CPU, and that's where something like this, the DeepCool AK620, comes into play. This particular version is the Zero Dark, but for $10 or so less, you can get the normal silver metallic version, or I've actually had my eye recently on this, the AK620 Digital. For only around another $10 or so more, you actually get digital integration with the cooler itself. And DeepCool this year have been on a bit of a roll when it comes to making quite innovative products that do things a little bit differently. Taking it out of the box, and you'll be able to see what it is that I mean. Now, it's a dual tower cooler with two sort of heat sinks, if you will, and a pair of included fans. But what makes it even more special is that if I peel off the lovely plastic, you actually have a gloss top panel with some RGB on either side and a screen which can display key information like your CPU temperatures. This cooler is particularly important when you look at the motherboard, as in this system we've managed to obviously pick up a B650 board. This provides overclocking support, unlike on Intel's architecture where you have to buy the really expensive motherboards to gain that functionality. It does so in a compact and more affordable micro ATX form factor, and if we take a look at the I/O, you get all the connections you really need. 2.5 gig Ethernet, USB 3.2, Gen 2 Type-C, and of course Type-A ports with display connections as well if you opt for a CPU with integrated graphics. As far as RAM or memory goes, I've been using quite a few different DDR5 kits recently, from Kingston to Crucial to Corsair to ADATA, but the TEAMGROUP T-Force Delta consistently ranks as one of the cheapest 32GB kits. In fact, I'll show you exactly how I picked this memory. I simply went onto the RAM section of PC Part Picker, selected that I wanted two 16GB DIMMs, 32's ideal for gaming, and I wanted to stick to a cache latency of between 30 and 32. I then searched by price low to high, as obviously we want to get the best value, and the TEAMGROUP T-Force Delta was the best looking kit that comes in under budget. Storage, it was a similar story. I wanted a 1TB Gen 4 NVMe drive, and the XPG GAMMIX S70 blade basically came top of the list when it comes to price to performance. It's a drive that we've used in loads of builds and been pretty happy with it all in all. Graphics, there was only really one choice for a build like this. I've gone for the ASUS TUF RX 7800 XT. Now, when I actually spec'd this in the build, I thought, oh, that feels maybe a little bit more expensive than I wanted to pay. But taking a look at all the different 7800 XTs on Newegg, and you can see that the price on these cards has shifted up slightly, especially after the whole holiday sales have gone away. Even still, it's not exactly on the top end of 7800 XTs and gives you the best looking cooler of all the cards in my opinion. Build quality also feels really solid, and we get access to AMD's new fluid motion frames, something I'm going to take a look at in more detail a little bit later, which is of course AMD's answer to Nvidia's frame generation that you get inside of DLSS. But what's pretty cool about it is that it's actually available for all DX11 and DX12 titles using any AMD Radeon 7000 or 6000 series GPU. Aside from that, the 7800 XT is the best value mid-range 1440p card you can buy right now. We've made some super good builds with it, and you can find our full review of that card in the card section and in the links in the description below. Case Price-wise, I'd already opted for a more affordable M.2 motherboard, and I didn't want something that was gonna be too big. The DeepCool CH370, super affordable, allows us to pour more money elsewhere in the build, and has great airflow. Not really much more you can ask for. Finally, to wrap things up, I also picked up an ASUS Tough power supply. Now, a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, matches the theme of the build quite nicely, ties in some tough parts, but that's not the only reason I opted to pick it up. In fact, it actually has some really good specifications. So not only is it 750 watts, but it's ATX3, which means a lot more than just the fact that you get a fancy 12-pin PCI power connector. You're also going to see better efficiency, of which this PSU is actually 80 plus gold, and more consistent power delivery to all of your components as part of that ATX3 standard. Talking of the new 12-pin, you get that on here alongside a fully modular interface, meaning you only plug in the cables you need. Plus, you get a 10-year warranty, which is actually on basically the top end of what you'll find on any power supply right now, guaranteeing that this is good now and into the future. A quick look at PC Part Picker in terms of estimated wattage, and you'll be able to see that the overall consumption for this build is in the region of 500 watts. AMD recommend a 700 watt power supply as part of their recommendations, so 750 and nice and efficient with that 80 plus gold rating will do us more than fine. So what are we waiting for? I'm gonna go ahead, order the bits that I'm missing, and then I'll see you in a few days to get this system built. So here we are, and I find myself saying this again, pretty good part selection. The first thing I'm gonna do, like with every build nowadays, is actually install the CPU, RAM, SSD, basically everything that will go into the motherboard first of all. It's kind of unusual for me to go for a Micro ATX motherboard, but it saves us a bit of money, and to be honest, especially nowadays, you don't need to install multiple graphics cards and crossfire configs or anything like that, so a standard M.2 design with one PCI slot is going to be more than enough. Ryzen 5 7600X is the first thing to pop into the build. As mentioned earlier, those core and thread counts make it perfectly sufficient for what we're trying to do today, and if you wanted something that's a little bit better for video editing or streaming, then you can knock up to the Ryzen 7 for a couple of extra cores without spending a fortune more money. Pop the cover down, the black plastic will of course fly off, but keep this safe for a little bit later, and then follow up with the RAM and the SSD. Latency is so important when it comes to DDR5 memory, and in our testing, latency actually matters more than speed. It's all about having RAM that responds nice and quickly, no matter how fast it completes the instruction. This T-Force Delta kit is also fairly low profile. I mean, it's not the smallest RAM kit in the world, but it's hardly massive either. This build's pretty simple, just going to use the grey RAM DIMM slots to actually get the memory into place. Bit of pressure on either side, and that will slot the RAM in without too many problems. M.2 NVMe drive is next up, and this is of course where the PS5 compatible GAMMIX S70 blade comes in. Now, in all seriousness, A-Data do some great drives, especially when it comes to price to performance. Pop off the actual heat shield or heat sink, and then of course slide the drive into place. Pop it down, get the little clip here, the toolless clip, out the way so the drive goes nice and flush, and then fasten this over the top of the NVMe. There we are. That's going to stop it from going anywhere, and we can finish things off by just popping this M.2 heatsink or heat shield straight back on. Couple of screws just to get it nice and tight on the left and of course the right hand side, and the motherboard assembly is pretty much done. I say pretty much because I am actually going to start installing the CPU cooler at this stage. First and foremost, take the fans off. We don't need to keep these on, and they're going to make life a bit harder. Similarly, this particular design, the top panel pops off, so get that out the way, and also remove the center fan as well for good measure. So with those out the way and the top plate kind of dangling, now's a good time to consider the instruction manual, which is in the accessory box of the CPU cooler. With this being a Ryzen config, I'm guessing we're going to have some slightly different steps to follow, but the instruction manual is always a great place to start. You can see from the manual that we need to take the pre-installed backplate screws and use these for these 4 posts, and then finish things off by popping these 2 brackets on top. It's these brackets right here that we'll be screwing the cooler down to in just a moment. To add those 4 posts on, pop the brackets on and tighten them up with a couple of thumb screws. It doesn't hurt to use a screwdriver here as well to make sure everything is nice and firm and that the cooler isn't going to go anywhere. A drop of the included thermal paste, and then you can pop the cooler itself back onto the motherboard. Central fan is going to return, but the outside, the second fan, is going to wait till later, so the motherboard is easier to screw into the case in the next stage. Then the top panel just goes back on, very, very nice, and the extra fan will just go here at the front a little bit later. For now though, I think the motherboard assembly, ow, that motherboard's quite sharp, is good to go. It's feeling pretty heavy, pretty chunky, but no RAM clearance issues from what I can see. Everything's in there pretty nicely, and it's time to move over into the case. Now, I've gone, as mentioned earlier, pretty cheap on the case. This is the DeepCool CH370, and I actually, for the price, really like it. You get loads of mesh at the front of the case. You also get this nice full-width tempered glass side panel, which is a bit of a fingerprint magnet. I'm going to pop this down now before I drop it, and with it being a bit smaller, it's going to keep the build size not quite to a minimum, but a bit more compact. It much easier fits on a desktop than something like a full-size case, which you'll be popping under your desk. So you can show it off, be proud of it, and have it next to you while you game. How lovely. Anyway, side panels, glass one, first of all, keep that nice and safe, and then do the same for the rear steel panel as well. I didn't sound good. Then it's a case of just lying the motherboard flat, checking all the standoffs, that's all these little posts in the motherboard. I think we're pretty much in the right place, just one extra one here to remove, then slide the motherboard in and get that screwed down. 3 screws at the top, 3 along the middle, and 2 down the bottom. And make sure you don't get your fan cable, that's this one here, trapped in the rear I/O, as that can of course cause you big problems and headaches later on. Some pretty good progress then is being made. And of course the next part to pop into this build is the graphics card. And that's where the tough RX 7800 XT comes in. Now, as I alluded to earlier, there's been a lot of talk recently about AMD fluid motion frames. You've obviously got technology like FSR, which basically upscales an image to basically give you the frame rate you'd achieve at a low resolution, but a visual fidelity that's more aligned with the native resolution in which you're gaming. But there's a step further that graphics card makers are now taking this technology, and they often call it frame generation. Fluid motion frames is a type of frame generation whereby the graphics card and the graphics driver take the 2 frames being rendered out by the GPU and the game engine and actually take the midpoint of those 2 frames and slot one in between. Now, for competitive titles, this isn't necessarily always the best idea because it's harder to predict on a frame-by-frame basis where you're going to see that advantage. But where it comes in really handy is on like simulation, RPG games, because you know when you're going into a corner that turning from one point to the other point is going to be a fluid motion with a predictable pattern in the middle. What's cool about fluid motion frames though is that AMD have enabled this on their drivers for all DX11, DX12 titles on Radeon 6 and 7000. Cool stuff. We tested it in a couple of games and here's what we found. The first game that we tested was Red Dead Redemption 2, and in all the titles we first tested without fluid motion frames enabled and then with it enabled. At 1440p high settings, this build and the 7800 XT pulled in 137 FPS on average. This is a pretty good frame rate as it stands, especially at 1440p, and shows off the power of the 7800 XT, but enabling fluid motion frames basically doubled the frame rate and pushed us up to 270. The doubling essentially of the frame rate here makes total sense when you consider the fact, of course, that fluid motion frames is interleaving one frame between the next. The game felt certainly a lot smoother. Whether it felt twice as smooth, I'm not totally sure, but it definitely helped and made our experience in Red Dead Redemption 2 quite a bit better. Move through into Starfield next up, a typically very hard game to run and a title whereby something like fluid motion frames or a frame generation technology can be really handy. 1440p high, all vanilla, the game managed to achieve 83 FPS on this build, not bad from the 7800 XT, while enabling fluid motion frames pushed us up to 152 FPS on average. Not quite a doubling here, but not far off, and certainly a much better experience in Starfield than at stock settings. Move through into The Witcher 3 and here the build pulled in 141 FPS, again at 1440p high settings with fluid motion frames disabled, while turning it on boosted us up to 234 FPS on average. Again, the game definitely felt noticeably better, and of course the fact this is an RPG makes it a great candidate for a technology like this. Hogwarts Legacy also did pretty well on this build, 126 FPS on average with fluid motion frames disabled at 1440p high settings, while turning it on bumped us up to 218. It really is pretty remarkable that you can just enable this on most DX11 and DX12 titles and it works totally fine, and it's great to see support for this not only on the 7800 XT, but the last gen 6000 series cards too. Finally, to wrap things up, a bit of Far Cry 6, not often one in our benchmark suite, and I don't really know why. 1440p high, fluid motion frames disabled, pulled in 139 FPS on average, while turning it on in Far Cry 6 boosted us up to 266 FPS on average. So with performance out the way, let's actually go ahead and pop this into the build. Now, as I say, 7800 XT, personal favourite of mine in terms of graphics cards. You get all that extra VRAM, 16 gigabytes over the alternative market options, giving you that bit more future-proofing, and you retain the standard dual 8-pin power connectors. This tough card looks lovely, it's a little bit on the large side, but that's going to aid with cooling, so no major complaints. I am slightly worried about it fitting. I'm pretty sure I did check this earlier, but let's let's actually find out, shall we? So let's hover it in. Oh, easy. Absolutely no problems at all. If you were planning on putting a push-pull radiator at the front, not going to happen. However, if you're just after fans, which is what I'll be doing in a moment's time, this will work fine. Unscrew your PCI lanes, push the clip back on the motherboard, and slide the graphics card in. And voila! We have a GPU that is now installed. And with that, all that remains is, of course, the power supply. Now, I mentioned this briefly earlier on, but what's quite impressive about this PSU, other than its compact design and great warranty, is all of the included cables, which are actually braided. So just a cheeky little motherboard cable, 2 parts make this possible. There we go, lovely stuff. And then also, of course, we've got the 12-pin power connector for the GPU, which we won't be using, as this card is a bit more old school and uses the dual 8-pin connections instead. Interestingly though, that still plugs up to the actual 12-pin interface on the card, so that's pretty good use of the connectors and simplifies things just a little bit, while a SATA power harness is also a good addition. There we are, pop that into the top, and then all that remains after that is, of course, for a CPU power connector. So 4 plus 4 pins, or 8 pins in total, the bottom of the power supply. These cables are actually really, really nice. Feel kind of rubbery, but also braided. I'm a fan. And with that, the build is pretty much good to go. All that's left to do is get the final front panel cables on, boot the system up, and see how it looks. And I can round this video off in the only way we know how. It's montage time.